I want to start by telling you something honest. I loved him before I understood him. That is the part that embarrasses me now, not because love is embarrassing, but because I spent 11 years of my life believing I understood Callan Morrow completely. I believed he was predictable. I believed he was gentle. I believed he was, to use the word that most of my people used when they found out about our marriage, harmless. That word, harmless. I have spent a long time thinking about that word since the day in the grand receiving hall when everything changed. I have turned it over in my mind the way you turn a stone over in your palm, looking for something underneath it. Harmless. It means poses no threat, will cause no damage, is safe to be near. It means something that can be dismissed. Something that does not need to be watched. My people, the Vo Essex, from the third atmospheric ring of Thelindra, we are a diplomatic species. We have been diplomatic for 6,000 years. We do not fight. We negotiate. We mediate. We have 17 words for compromise in our language and 0 words for sword. When we encountered humanity for the first time, 143 years ago, we catalogued them the way we catalog every new species we find. We measured their technology. We measured their biology. We measured their political structures. We read their history, and yes, we saw the wars, all of them, every ugly, terrible one of them, but we also saw that their wars had mostly stopped. They had a unified Earth Council. They had signed the Galactic Confederacy Accords. They shook hands with delegates and smiled and brought food to every meeting. They seemed, by every available measurement, to be trying very hard to be peaceful. So the Confederacy gave them Tier 7 status, passive companion species, the same classification as the Murilli, who are essentially sentient moss, and the Drekavik, who are large and slow and have no instinct for violence whatsoever. Tier 7 means, we do not worry about these people. Tier 7 means, invite them to the parties, let them carry things, appreciate their cultural offerings, and do not give them access to weapon systems. Tier 7 means harmless. I want to be very clear that I am not telling this story to make my people look foolish. We were not foolish. We were working with the information we had. The humans were genuinely trying. They genuinely wanted peace. They had dismantled most of their old weapon platforms. They had opened their borders to Confederacy inspectors. They had done everything right. What we failed to understand, what none of us understood, not really, was the difference between a species that has become peaceful and a species that has forgotten how to fight. Those are not the same thing. I know that now. I know it because of Callan. I met him at a cultural exchange symposium on Station Aurelis, which sits in the neutral corridor between human space and the Confederacy's outer diplomatic rings. It is a beautiful station, if you have not been, all sweeping glass corridors and multi-gravity observation decks, and a central atrium that is open to 6 different atmospheric pressures at once, which means that depending on where you stand, you can see beings of 40 different species all occupying the same space, breathing different air, living different lives, all of them coexisting with a kind of practiced grace that makes you feel briefly like the universe is doing something right. I was 26 years old. I was in my second posting as a junior cultural attaché. I was supposed to be cataloging human artistic traditions for a Confederacy research brief on Tier 7 species cultural output, which sounds boring because it is boring, and I was bored, and I was standing next to a table loaded with human food that I was not sure I could eat, and Callan Morrow was standing on the other side of that table looking equally uncertain about a platter of Vo Essex crystalline pastries. He was, I want to describe him accurately because it matters later for reasons that will become clear. He was not tall for a human, average height. Brown skin, dark eyes, a quality of quietness about him that I noticed immediately because most humans I had met up to that point were loud in a charming way, always talking, always gesturing, always filling the space around them with noise and energy. Callan was not like that. He stood still. He looked at things carefully before he touched them. He had hands that moved deliberately, not fast, and he held himself with a posture that was neither tense nor relaxed, but something precise in between, like something that has found its exact right position and decided to stay there. I later learned that humans call that posture standing at ease. It is a military thing, the body's way of being ready without showing that it is ready. I did not know that at the time. He reached out and picked up one of the crystalline pastries, turned it over very carefully in his fingers, and then looked up and found me watching him, and instead of being embarrassed, he just said quietly, "Is this food or is this a decoration?" And I said, "It is both." And he said, and set it down very gently exactly where he had found it, and then he smiled at me, and it was the kind of smile that does not try to be charming. It just is. That was 11 years ago. We were not supposed to fall in love. Not in any formal rule-breaking sense. The Confederacy does not prohibit interspecies relationships, and my people have no cultural taboo against it. But it was unusual. Not unprecedented, but unusual. Humans and Voesics do not have obvious points of connection. Our biology is entirely different. Our lifespans are similar enough to make a relationship practical, but our sensory experiences are not aligned. I see in a frequency range humans cannot. I process sound differently. I have a secondary circulatory system that has no human analog. We inhabit the same physical spaces, but we experience those spaces in genuinely different ways. What we had in common was quietness and carefulness, and a preference for understanding things before commenting on them. He worked at that time as a historical consultant for the Human Liaison Office. His specific area was pre-unification military history, which I found interesting because he was the least militaristic person I had ever met. He did not talk about battles in an excited way. He talked about them the way a doctor talks about diseases, with precision and a kind of personal distance, like someone who has studied something dark long enough to understand it, but not so long that they have stopped being troubled by it. He had served. I found this out gradually over months. The Unified Earth Council maintained a small ceremonial defense force, mostly for escort duties, honor guards, that kind of thing, not a war machine. Callan had spent 6 years in it before transitioning to historical research. He had not seen combat. There had been nothing to see combat in. The universe had been, for those years, peaceful enough that Earth's defense force was essentially a uniformed academic institution, with better posture than most academic institutions. He was 31 when we met. He had been a soldier for 6 years and had never fired a weapon at another living thing. Harmless, my colleagues said when I told them I was serious about him. He's quite harmless, Tharindel, very charming in a human way, but harmless. I agreed with them. I was wrong about what that meant. We married in a ceremony that had to be conducted in 2 separate atmospheric sections of Station Orales, because the standard Voesic ceremony requires an atmosphere that would give Callan a mild headache after about 20 minutes, and the human traditions involve a lot of flowers that trigger a histamine response in my secondary respiratory system. We compromised. We always compromised. That was, I think, one of the things that made us work. He learned 17 Voesic words for compromise in our first year together. He never learned the Voesic word for sword, because we do not have one. I know that is a small detail, but I think about it sometimes. Languages contain the shapes of what their speakers believe they need. My language has 17 ways to say we found a middle ground because for 6,000 years, that was the skill we kept needing. Callan's language has, I looked this up once for our own reasons, at least 40 distinct words and phrases for the moment before violence begins. Tension. Standoff, impasse, confrontation, escalation, flashpoint. His language evolved around the shapes of things his people kept needing. I did not think about this at the time. The first 3 years of our marriage were spent on Orales. I was promoted to mid-level cultural attaché. Callan continued his research and took on a teaching role at the station's Multi-Species Historical Institute, where he taught per-contact history to students from 11 different species. He was a good teacher, patient, clear. He had a way of making students from very different cognitive backgrounds all understand the same material, because he approached each student's understanding as a separate problem to be solved carefully, not a standard pathway to be followed. He cooked. He cooked constantly because humans seem to use cooking as a form of meditation, and Callan was no exception. Our quarters always smelled of things he was making, earth things mostly, spices I had to ask him to identify, proteins in combinations I found initially alarming and eventually comforting. He made me something called dal once a week, because it was the first human food I had tried that my secondary digestive system processed without complaint, and from that point forward he treated it as a weekly offering, a small ritual, something that meant I thought about what you need and I prepared it. That is a very human thing to do, to show love through preparation. I know that now too. I learned him slowly. I learned that he slept lightly and always woke facing the door. I learned that he kept a very old, very battered book beside our bed, a physical book, paper and ink, which is unusual even for humans at this point, and that he read from it most nights but never told me what was in it, only that it was something his grandfather had given him. I learned that he had a scar along his left forearm that he got, he said, from a training accident, and that he never elaborated on this and I never pushed. I learned that he was extraordinarily calm in situations that made other people agitated, and that this calm was not the calm of someone who does not care, but the calm of someone who has learned to save their reactions for when they matter. I learned that he watched. This is the thing that I did not understand the significance of in all those years. Callan watched things. When we entered a room, any room, he would do this very brief, very quiet survey, exits, occupants, layout, in about 3 seconds. He did it so naturally that I had to notice it many times before I consciously registered it as a habit. He watched people when they talked to him, not in a suspicious way, but with a quality of full attention that was almost unnerving, like being in the light of something that has decided to focus on you entirely. He watched the station's security rotation, not obviously, not in a way that would raise flags, but I noticed after a few years that he always knew when the guard shifts changed. I asked him about it once and he said, very simply, "It's just interesting," and went back to reading, and I believed him because why wouldn't I? He was Callan, my husband, a historian, a cook, a quiet, careful man who had never hurt anyone. Harmless. God, that word. 4 years into our posting on Aurelis, a new political structure arrived in the Confederacy's outer rings. I will try to explain this as clearly as I can, because the politics matter for what comes later. The Galactic Confederacy was not, at that time, a single unified government in any meaningful sense. It is more accurately described as a web of trade agreements, diplomatic treaties and mutual non-aggression pacts, held together by common economic interest and the general desire of its member species to not die in interstellar wars. It has a council. The council has delegated authority over specific things, trade regulation, species classification, diplomatic protocol, but it does not have an army. It does not need one, or did not need one, because the member species had all agreed to maintain their own defense forces and to not use those defense forces against other members. The operative word is members. The Kethsaron were not members. The Kethsaron they still exist, though in considerably reduced circumstances, a species from the outer systems beyond Confederacy space. Militaristic, hierarchical, their biological structure favors it. They are large, they process adrenaline analogs extremely efficiently, they have a bone density roughly 3 times that of a veau Essex and about twice that of a human, and their sensory range includes frequencies that allow them to track movement through solid walls at close range. They had never joined the Confederacy because they had never needed to. They had their own resources, their own trade networks, their own sphere of influence. What they did not have, increasingly, was room to expand. The Kethsaron expand. It is not a cultural preference. It is closer to a biological imperative. Their population growth is aggressive. Their resource consumption is aggressive. Their political model essentially requires territorial acquisition at regular intervals to keep their internal power structures stable. For 200 years, they had been expanding into unclaimed space. But unclaimed space is finite, and eventually you reach the edge of it, and the next space is not unclaimed. The Confederacy had been in cautious negotiation with them for about 30 years, which is to say, the Confederacy had been offering them trade agreements while quietly hoping they would run out of momentum before they ran out of unclaimed territory. They ran out of unclaimed territory first. The year that changed everything on Station Orales, the Kethsaron Expansion Directorate sent its first diplomatic delegation to a Confederacy station. The station was Orales. The stated purpose was preliminary discussions about possible associate membership in the Confederacy, which would regulate their expansion through economic channels rather than military ones. The actual purpose, as became clear much later, was reconnaissance. They sent 12 delegates. 2 of them were what the Kethsaron call Vethak, a rank that translates roughly as military cultural attaché, which is a diplomatic title that means soldier placed in diplomatic context to assess threat levels. The other 10 were genuine diplomats, from the Expansion Directorate's Foreign Relations branch. The Confederacy Council sent 3 of their own senior delegates to meet them, plus support staff and cultural attachés. I was assigned to the team in my capacity as a mid-level cultural specialist. My specific job was to facilitate introductory cultural exchange sessions, an icebreaker function, essentially. Help both sides find points of connection before the hard political conversations began. Callan came with me. Spouses of diplomatic personnel were permitted in the station's civilian zones, and Callan had been asked by the Historical Institute to document the first Kethsaron diplomatic visit as a historical record. He brought his notebook and his recording equipment and his quiet, watchful presence, and he sat in the corner of orientation sessions and took notes, and I was glad to have him there. I remember thinking, the first morning of the delegation's arrival, that things seemed to be going well. I remember that very clearly. The Kethsaron were, I want to be accurate here and not sensationalist. They were large. Significantly larger than Voesix, and also significantly larger than humans. The delegation's delegates averaged about 2.5 meters in height and were proportionally broad, with a physical density that you feel when they enter a room. The air pressure changes slightly, the sound dynamics shift, your perception of the available space contracts. They had a natural coloration that ranged from deep copper to dark green, and their faces were structured differently from most Confederacy species. Flatter, wider, with eye placement that allowed a broader field of vision than any species I had previously worked with. They were also, I will say this plainly, in the habit of touching things. This is a Kethsaron sensory behavior. They have tactile receptors across their forearms and hands that function as a primary assessment tool. When they enter a new space, they touch surfaces, objects, structural elements, not destructively, not aggressively, but constantly, and with a thoroughness that made the Confederacy's diplomatic team visibly uncomfortable on the first day. Because the Confederacy runs on a protocol of you do not touch anything without permission. And here were 12 Kethsaron running their hands along corridor walls and equipment panels and conference table edges and chairs. And the Confederacy staff were all standing very still and breathing very carefully. I did what I could. I explained the behavior to the Confederacy team and explained the Confederacy's spatial protocols to the Kethsaron liaison. I found a workable middle ground. We agreed that the Kethsaron delegates could touch objects in common areas, but would request before touching anything personal or private. The Kethsaron accepted this with what seemed like genuine good faith. The first 2 days were tense but functional. Callan sat in his corner and watched and took notes. On the evening of the second day, he said something to me that I have thought about many times since. We were in our quarters, and I was reviewing the next day's session agenda, and he was making tea, and he said, very casually, "The two on the left of the main delegation, they're not diplomats." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "The way they stand, the way they watch people. They're assessing the room every time they enter it, not for cultural information, for tactical information." He paused. He poured the tea. "They're soldiers." I told him he was imagining things. I told him the Confederacy had vetted the delegation. I told him that the Kethsaron diplomatic approach was simply more structured than he was used to, and that he was projecting military frameworks from his historical research onto people who did not deserve that interpretation. He nodded slowly. He handed me my tea. He said, "You're probably right." But he did not go back to his notes that night. He sat and drank his tea and looked at the middle distance, which was what Callan did when he was thinking carefully, and he did not stop thinking until he fell asleep. Day 3 was when the grand receiving hall was opened for the formal diplomatic welcome ceremony. The grand receiving hall of Station Aurelis is exactly what its name suggests, a massive, sweeping ceremonial space at the station's central hub, capable of accommodating several hundred beings at once in its open circular design. It has a domed ceiling made of observation glass, which on a clear rotation gives you a view of open space above, stars, and the distant curve of the neutral corridor's marker buoys. The floor is polished to a mirror finish, a Essex design convention, representing reflection and reciprocity. The walls are hung with the insignia of every Confederacy member species, arranged in the order of their joining, and the newest addition, human insignia, sits in the outer ring, where all new members begin. It is a beautiful room. It is designed to make people feel that they are part of something large and dignified and important. It is also, as Callan noted quietly to me as we entered on the morning of the ceremony, a terrible room if anything goes wrong. I asked him what he meant. One entrance that's big enough for crowd movement, 3 maintenance exits that most people won't think of. The ceiling is glass, beautiful, but structurally it distributes pressure unevenly at the joints, and there are only 8 station security personnel assigned to the perimeter. He said this in the same tone you might say, "I think it might rain later." Then he smiled at me and said, "It's a beautiful room. I'm glad they opened it for this." I should have listened to the first part instead of the second. The ceremony began well. The Confederacy's senior delegate, Mithran Solis, a Essex elder diplomat with 50 years of experience, delivered the opening welcome in the formal Confederacy manner, a ritual acknowledgement of shared space, shared air, shared light. The Kethsaron delegation received this in a posture that their liaison had explained to me was their equivalent of respectful attention. There were approximately 300 people in the room, the Confederacy diplomatic team and their support staff, the Kethsaron delegation, a contingent of station residents who had been invited to observe, academics, cultural figures, a few journalists from the Confederacy's information network, and on one side with the civilian observers, Callan, with his notebook. The formal address was followed by a gift exchange, objects of cultural significance presented by each side. The Confederacy offered the Kethsaron a resonance crystal formation from Thalindra, which is a significant gift by our standards, representing clarity of intention. The Kethsaron offered the Confederacy delegation an object that their liaison described as a recognition stone, a piece of mineral from the Kethsaron homeworld, smooth and dark, and slightly warm to the touch, which apparently represents the acknowledgement of another species as worth knowing. It was going well. And then the junior delegate from the Kethsaron Expansion Directorate, A being called Vethais Koron, who had been standing third from the left of the main delegation line, stepped forward. He stepped forward not in the way that someone steps forward to speak or to present something. He stepped forward in the way that someone steps forward when they have decided that waiting is finished. I noticed it before I understood it. I think everyone in the room noticed it a fraction of a second before they understood it, because the room did that thing rooms do when something is wrong. It got quieter in a way that had nothing to do with any individual person going quiet, but rather all the air leaving all the mouths at once. Vethais Koron reached into the formal vestments of the Kethsaron diplomatic robe, a place where our security scanners had registered only organic material, because Kethsaron diplomatic vestments are layered in ways that apparently diffuse signature readings more effectively than the Confederacy's technology had accounted for, and he removed a weapon. It was not a large weapon. That sounds like it should be a comfort, but it was not. It was a directed energy emitter, small enough to hold in one hand, but calibrated, as we later determined, to deliver enough charge to kill a Voesix or a human at close range, and to seriously incapacitate a Kethsaron opponent. It was a precision instrument. It was pointed at Mithrin Salis, who was standing at the front of the Confederacy delegation, 3 meters away. The other delegate I had not been sure about, the second one Callan had pointed out, was already moving, not toward Salis, toward the room's main entrance. He moved with the practiced speed of someone who has done this before, and what he was doing, I understood later, was positioning himself at the exit to prevent anyone from leaving or entering. The other 10 members of the Kethsaron delegation had not moved. Their faces showed expressions that I recognized, even across the species barrier, as something between shock and the sick recognition of people who have been used without being told they were being used. They had not known. The Vethak, the soldiers disguised as delegates, had acted unilaterally. Vethais Koron said something. He said it in Kethsaron primary language, and the translation came through the room's communication system a beat later. The Expansion Directorate's patience with the Confederacy's slowness has concluded. Senior Delegate Salis will accompany us as a guarantor of the Directorate's negotiating position. The Confederacy will immediately begin processing territorial transfer documents for Sectors 7 through 12 of the Outer Rim. This is not a request. 300 people. 300 people in a room with one exit and a glass ceiling and a soldier at the door, and a weapon pointed at the most senior diplomatic figure in the Confederacy's outer ring. I could not breathe. I felt Callan, somewhere behind me and to my left, and I wanted to turn around and look at him, and I could not make myself move at all. The 8-station security personnel had their hands up, empty, in the universal gesture of we are not doing anything threatening, which is the correct protocol in a hostage situation, to not escalate, to buy time. They had already signaled for backup through their comms. Backup was 12 minutes away minimum, because this was a diplomatic station, and its security forces were not a rapid response unit. 12 minutes is a very long time when someone is pointing a weapon at your most senior colleague. Salis was standing very still. She was old and she was experienced, and she knew how to not give an aggressor the satisfaction of visible fear. But I could see, from where I stood, that her primary hands were trembling. Vethais Koron took one step toward her, then another. And then I heard from somewhere behind me a sound. I want to try to describe this sound accurately, because it has stayed with me, exact and complete, in a way that very few sounds in my life have. It was a metallic sound, a sliding, ringing sound, 2 surfaces of metal separating from each other in a long, smooth, deliberate motion. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. In the context of the room's silence, 300 people not breathing, it was loud enough to carry across the entire space. And then it stopped. And Vethais Koron stopped moving. Not because the sound frightened him. Kethsaron Vethek are not easily frightened. He stopped because he turned, the way trained soldiers turn when they register an unknown tactical variable, to identify the source of the sound and assess whether it required his attention. What he saw was Callan. Callan had moved from the civilian observer section to an open space to the right of the Confederacy diplomatic team. He had done this quietly enough that I had not heard him move, and I had been listening for him. He was standing in the center of that open space, which put him approximately equidistant from Vethai's Koran and the soldier at the door, and he was holding a sword. I want to pause here because I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like a story someone made up to make a dramatic point. I promise you it is not. Callan had a sword. It was, I learned this later in exhaustive detail because it became extremely important, a sword that had belonged to his grandfather and his grandfather's father, and before that to a line of soldiers reaching back several generations on Earth. A real sword. An old one. Not an energy weapon, not a modern implement. A sword made of steel, approximately 1 meter in total length, with a worn leather grip that showed the marks of many hands. He had carried it onto Aurelis in his personal effects, legally, because Confederacy customs regulations had a provision, inserted 70 years ago and never revisited, because it had never been relevant, allowing the transport of antique, non-powered cultural artifacts without restriction. A sword qualified as an antique, non-powered cultural artifact. No one had thought about this provision in decades. No one had thought a sword would matter. He held it the way, and I am using the word that 3 different military analysts used in their later assessments, the way someone holds it when it is not a prop and not a display. Straight arm. Blade at a specific angle that the analysts described as guard position, which I was told means, I am not attacking, but I am ready and I will not be surprised. His weight was shifted very slightly forward. His feet were placed in a particular way. His face was completely, utterly calm. He looked at Vethai's Koran and he said, very quietly, in a voice that carried because everything else was silent, "Put it down." I need to tell you what happened in the Kethsaron's mind in that moment, because it was explained to me afterward by the Kethsaron liaison, who was one of the genuine diplomats, and who later became a significant figure in the post-incident negotiations, and who was deeply invested in making sure someone from the Confederacy understood the exact sequence of events. The Kethsaron-Vethak classification of threats is heavily dependent on biological indicators, size, bone density, biochemical markers for adrenaline analogs, visible armament and its destructive potential. When Vethai's Koran saw Callan, his instinctive assessment would have been small, low-density, non-Kethsaron species armed with a non-powered single-blade antique weapon. Threat classification, minimal, a curiosity at most. The Kethsaron do not have a historical relationship with bladed weapons in the same way humans do. They transitioned from their early period physical combat tools directly to energy weapons. They never had a sustained era of blade warfare. The sword in Callan's hand registered to Vethai's Koran primarily as primitive and secondarily as puzzling. He laughed. It was a Kethsaron laugh, a short, percussive exhalation that reads as contempt, and he said, again through the translation system, "Human. You are going to threaten me with that." Callan said nothing. He did not move. He did not lower the sword. And this is where something started to shift in the room, because Vethai's Koran's threat assessment protocol works on the assumption that when you express contempt for a threat, the threat responds. It defends itself, or it retreats, or it escalates in a way that gives you information. What the protocol does not have a category for, and this was confirmed by the military analysts, is an opponent who simply stays. Callan stayed. He stood there with his sword at guard position, and he looked at Vethai's Koran with an expression that I had never seen on his face in 11 years of marriage, and which I can only describe now as patient, like someone who has started a process and intends to see it through. Vethai's Koran started moving towards Salih's again. Callan moved. I am going to describe this carefully because accuracy matters. This is not a story about superhuman ability. Callan is not superhuman. He is a man of average height and average build who spent 6 years in a ceremonial defense force and 37 years living with the inherited knowledge of what his species has spent 10,000 years learning to do to each other. He moved toward Vethai's Koran at an angle, not straight at him, not a frontal approach, which would have been suicidal, but diagonal, which put him between Vethai's Koran and Sally's, and he moved fast enough that Vethai's Koran had to redirect to track him, which meant the weapon was no longer pointed at Sally's, which meant the 8 security personnel could move Sally's backward toward the secondary section of the hall. Vethai's Koran swung the emitter toward Callan and fired. He missed. He missed because Callan had continued moving in the same diagonal direction without stopping, without hesitating, without any reaction that would have been appropriate if you were a being who had reasonable expectations of your own survival in this situation. And the energy discharge cut through the space where Callan had been half a second earlier and scored a burning line across the polished floor. Then Callan was inside the distance where the emitter was effective, too close for the directed beam to focus. And he did something with the sword and with his body simultaneously that resulted in Vethai's Koran stumbling sideways, the emitter no longer in his hand, and Callan between him and the rest of the room. I am not a trained observer of physical conflict. I cannot give you a technical breakdown. What I can tell you is that the whole sequence, from Callan's first movement to Vethai's Koran stumbling without his weapon, took less than 4 seconds. I know this because the surveillance footage was analyzed later, frame by frame, and the analysts put the elapsed time at 3.7 seconds. The emitter slid across the polished floor. The second Vethak at the door had begun moving when Callan had moved. He was larger than his partner, and he covered the distance fast. He was 6 steps away when the emitter hit the floor. Callan turned to face him. He raised the sword. I want to tell you about that moment. The moment when Callan turned and raised the sword, because it is the moment that the document is named for, and it is the moment that 300 people in that room have described in their testimonies, and every description uses different words but arrives at the same place. He raised the sword slowly, not hesitantly, not with uncertainty or drama, slowly in the way that things move when they are done by someone who is not in a hurry because they are not afraid, and they are not afraid because they have decided that there is only one way this ends and they have made peace with that decision, and there is therefore nothing left to be afraid of. Slowly in the way that a door closes when someone closes it with complete intention and no desire for it to make a sound. The second Vethak stopped. He stopped because, and this is from his own testimony, given months later in post-incident interviews, he stopped because nothing in his training or his experience had prepared him for this specific input. A being of significantly inferior physical capacity, standing in the path of a being of superior physical capacity, raising a primitive weapon slowly, and with complete composure, while the room around them had gone so quiet that you could hear the station's environmental systems cycling air. He stopped because, at a very deep instinctive level that his training had not managed to reach, something told him that he was the one in danger. Not because of the sword. The sword could not kill a Kethsaron Vethak. The materials were wrong and the physics were wrong and the size differential made it wildly impractical. The sword was not the danger. The certainty was the danger. He said afterward, I have read his testimony many times. I have faced armed opponents. I have faced species with superior technology and superior numbers. I have never faced something like that. He raised that sword like he had already seen how it ended, and he had decided it was acceptable. I did not know what to do with that. Nothing in my training told me what to do with that. He stopped. He stood there. He looked at Callan. Callan held the sword steady and looked back. 47 seconds. I counted them afterward from the footage. 47 seconds of stillness. Two beings looking at each other across 4 meters of polished floor, while behind Callan the security personnel moved Solis to safety and established a perimeter. And in front of Callan, the second Vethak stood in the light of something he did not understand and could not categorize and did not know how to defeat. The station backup security arrived at second 43. They came through 3 entrances simultaneously, which meant that even if the second Vethak had decided to move, he had nowhere useful to move to. He put his hands up at second 48. 1 second after Callan lowered the sword. The aftermath was loud and complicated and lasted for months. The immediate aftermath, the first hour, was a kind of controlled chaos that I remember in fragments. People rushing, medical personnel, the Confederacy's diplomatic security team, who had been en route the entire time and arrived to find the situation already contained, which created a peculiar quality of anticlimax in the room. Station Commander Vrelix, who overrides everything in an emergency situation, arriving and looking at the footage on her tablet and asking her security chief, very quietly, "What is that human holding?" And being told, "A sword, Commander," and going very still for a moment before she said, equally quietly, "Get me the Confederacy Council on secure channel immediately." I found Callan sitting against the wall of the grand receiving hall, on the floor, with his back against the wall in the way that people sit when their legs have decided to stop cooperating. The sword was in a security evidence bag nearby. They had asked for it, and he had handed it over without argument. He had a small burn on his left arm from the near miss of the energy discharge, and a station medic was treating it, and he was watching the medic work with a kind of detached interest, as if his arm belonged to someone he was curious about. I sat down next to him. I did not have words. I tried to find them and could not. I sat next to him on the polished floor of the grand receiving hall, and I took his right hand in both of mine and I held it. He turned to look at me. His face was the face I had always known, quiet, careful, a little tired, but there was something in his eyes that had not been there before or that I had not seen before, and I understand now that it had always been there. Underneath the historian, underneath the cook, underneath the man who held crystalline pastries carefully, and slept facing the door and watched every room he entered. It had always been there. He looked at me and he said simply, "You okay?" Not "I'm okay." Not "that was terrifying, but I handled it." Not any version of the thing you say when you are the one who just did something extraordinary. Just, "Are you okay?" I said no. He said, "Yeah, me either." And then the medic finished with his arm, and the station security team came to start their formal incident interview process, and we got up off the floor, and the rest of it began. The Confederacy Council's formal investigation into the Grand Receiving Hall incident, which the official records call the Quiet Sword incident, lasted 4 months. I testified 11 times. Callan testified more. A great deal of those testimonies were not about what had happened in the hall. They were about how it had happened, about what it meant. The Confederacy's Strategic Analysis Division assigned a team of 23 researchers to the question of human military capacity, prompted by what Callan had done and what it implied. This team had access to everything: Earth's historical archives, the Human Defense Force's internal training records, the physical and cognitive analysis data collected during the human species tier classification process. What they found was not comfortable. What they found was that the Confederacy had made an error, not a malicious error, not even a careless error. They had made the error that well-meaning people make when they see the surface of something and assume it represents the whole. They had looked at humanity and seen a species that had stopped fighting and concluded, from that observation, that humanity had lost the capacity for it. They had not lost the capacity, they had put it down. There is a difference. The research team's report, which I have read in its entirety because I requested access and it was granted, described this difference using a metaphor that I found striking. They wrote, "Imagine a civilization that after centuries of building fires for warmth transitions to central heating. The fires stop. The fireplaces are sealed. The wood is not gathered. Children grow up without having built a fire." An observer arriving at this point would be forgiven for concluding that these people cannot make fire. But the knowledge of fire does not leave a species. It is encoded in hands that remember the motion. It is encoded in the part of the brain that tracked, for 100,000 years, where the dry wood was and which direction the wind was blowing. You can seal the fireplaces and stop gathering the wood, but you cannot unseal the knowing. Humanity had sealed its fireplaces. They had ended their wars. They had dismantled their major weapon platforms and submitted to Confederacy inspection and signed every accord and meant every signature. They had tried. They were still trying. They had been trying sincerely for the entire period of their Confederacy membership. But the knowing was still there. In Callan's hands. In the 6 years of posture and movement and assessment that had become his body's default operating system. In the 47 seconds of absolute stillness, facing a being who outweighed him by 200 kilograms. In the 3.7 seconds of movement that had disarmed and repositioned a Kethsaron Vethak without Callan sustaining a direct hit. The research team calculated, conservatively, that the relevant ancestral behavioral capacity in the average adult human had a substantially higher retention rate than any previously classified Tier 7 species. Substantially higher, in fact, than most Tier 4 and Tier 5 species. The recommendation was reclassification to Tier 2, active combatant intelligence, with immediate review of all treaty provisions pertaining to human access to technology and strategic positioning. The Council approved it. Earth's ambassador to the Confederacy, a woman named Yusra Omel, who had spent 20 years building the diplomatic framework that had gotten humanity its Tier 7 status, and who had worked extraordinarily hard to represent her species as peaceful and reasonable and non-threatening, received the reclassification notification and was quiet for a very long time. Then she said to her diplomatic staff, "Well, at least they're not wrong." The Kethsaron Expansion Directorate recalled its delegation immediately. The two Vethak were remanded to Confederacy custody on charges of diplomatic fraud and attempted hostage-taking, which are serious offenses under Confederacy law. The 10 genuine diplomats were permitted to return home under their own recognizance, with the understanding that a formal renegotiation of the Kethsaron's relationship with the Confederacy would begin as soon as the political situation allowed. That renegotiation eventually happened, about a year later. The Kethsaron did join the Confederacy, eventually, as associate members, with territorial expansion regulated through economic channels as the Confederacy had originally proposed. The incident was a setback to that process, but not a fatal one. The genuine diplomatic members of that delegation, who had, by all accounts, been genuinely horrified by what the Vethak had done, worked hard to repair the damage. I know some of them. I have worked with them in the years since. They are not their soldiers. They are not their expansion directorate. They are people trying to find a way for their species to exist in a universe that has gotten smaller, and that is a legitimate and difficult thing to be. What happened to Callan, in the official record, is this. He was given a formal commendation by Station Commander Vrelix for extraordinary civilian action in a hostage situation. He was thanked by Senior Delegate Solis in a private meeting that lasted about 40 minutes and during which, Solis told me later, Callan was polite and slightly uncomfortable and kept saying it was the only thing that had made sense to do and he was glad she was okay. The Human Defense Force, quietly and without any public announcement, offered him a commission, a real one, not a ceremonial posting. They were, the officer who contacted us explained, reassessing the value of historically oriented personnel with relevant practical backgrounds. Callan thought about it for 3 weeks. He turned it down. He said to me, when he had made the decision, "I spent 6 years learning how to do what I did in that room, and then I spent 11 years hoping I would never have to use it. I'd like to go back to the second thing." He went back to teaching. He went back to writing history. He went back to making dal on a weekly schedule and reading his grandfather's book before sleep and standing at ease in every room we entered. He still does all of those things. The sword is in a case in our quarters now. Vrelix returned it to him after the investigation, cleaned and with a new evidence seal broken. He does not display it. It sits in the case and the case sits on a shelf, and sometimes I look at it and think about the sound it made when he drew it, that long, smooth, ringing slide of metal on metal, and about how I heard that sound and did not understand in the first moment what I was hearing. I understand now. I have been thinking for the years since that day about the word harmless. I have been thinking about what it actually means versus what we mean when we use it about a person. We say harmless when we mean has not harmed. We say harmless when we mean does not seem likely to harm. We say harmless when we mean I do not need to be concerned about this. All of those things were true of Callan in a genuine sense on the morning of the grand receiving hall ceremony. He had not harmed anyone. He did not seem likely to harm anyone. I was not concerned about him. But harmless, truly harmless, means does not have the capacity, and that was never Callan. What Callan had was intent. The intent to not harm, held actively, consistently, over years and decades, in the same way you hold something carefully when you know it is breakable. Not passive absence of danger, but active, daily, chosen restraint. That is not the same as harmlessness. That is something much more complicated and much more interesting and, honestly, much more admirable. The Confederacy reclassified humanity because they finally understood this. Humanity is not a species that lost its teeth and learned to live on soft food. Humanity is a species that grew new teeth and then decided with considerable effort to keep its mouth mostly closed. The decision is ongoing. It is not guaranteed. It requires work because the teeth are still there. I know this because I am married to a man who worked at it every day for 11 years, quietly and without announcement. And on the day when the work required that he stop, briefly, for 3.7 seconds he stopped. And what was underneath was exactly what 40,000 years of human history had put there. And then he picked the work back up again and kept going. I want to tell you about the night after the incident. After the testimonies and the medical checks and the security interviews and the council communications and all the complicated machinery of official response had finally, around the 3rd hour past station midnight, gone quiet enough that we could be alone in our quarters. We sat in the kitchen. I made tea because Callan had been making tea for me for 11 years and I wanted to do something. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands, which were still. They had not shaken during the incident or after it, but now, in the quiet, they had a slight tremor that he was noticing with the same detached interest he had given his burned arm earlier. "Adrenaline," he said, to no one in particular. "Always comes out afterward." I brought the tea and sat across from him, and we were quiet for a while. Then I said, "You knew last night. You said they were soldiers." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "And this morning, you assessed the room." "Yes." "You always assess rooms." "Yes." I looked at him. He looked back. He looked exactly like himself, the man I had married, the historian, the cook, the quiet person who held crystalline pastries carefully. "Callan," I said, "who are you?" He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about everything, and then he said, "Someone who learned a lot of things and has been choosing every day which ones to use." I thought about that. "What made you choose today in the hall?" He wrapped both hands around his tea. He looked at the table for a moment. Solly's was going to be hurt. You were in the room. 300 people were in the room. He looked up. The math wasn't complicated. The math, I said. Yeah. You could have died. Could have, he agreed. Does that? I stopped. I tried again. Were you afraid? He was honest with me the way he had always been honest with me, carefully, with attention to accuracy. Yes, but not the way you'd think. Not afraid of being hurt, more afraid of miscalculating, of doing the wrong thing, of making it worse. He paused. The other kind of afraid, the personal kind, that was there, but it was quiet. It's been quiet since I was about 23. I don't know if that's training or just how I am. 23. The middle of his 6 years in the Defense Force. I thought about the young man who had walked into whatever that training was, and the man who had walked out with something quiet in the place where fear used to be loud, and what that cost, and what it made possible. The sword, I said. You've been carrying it for 11 years. It was my grandfather's. It was his father's. It was, he stopped. It's been in my family a long time. You carry what the people before you give you. But you could have carried it in storage. Yes. Why didn't you? He thought about this. Because I never know, he said simply. I never know what day it's going to be. I filed this document 8 months after the incident, at the request of the Confederacy Historical Preservation Division, who wanted a first-hand account from someone who had known Callan Morrow before, during, and after the events in the Grand Receiving Hall. I have tried to write it accurately, and I have tried to write it honestly, and I have tried to capture the thing that I think matters most, which is not the incident itself. The incident is documented in surveillance footage and testimony and analysis reports, but the before of it. The 11 years of a man being exactly who he is, every day, in ways that no one thought to look at carefully enough to see. He was never harmless. No human is. I do not mean that as a threat. I mean it as an observation, offered carefully, by someone who has had 11 years and one extraordinary morning to think about it. They are a species that carries what the people before them gave them. They carry 10,000 years of fire and iron, and the knowledge of exactly where the dry wood is and which way the wind blows. They carry it in their hands and their posture and the specific way they assess every room they enter. They have chosen, for the most part, with considerable ongoing effort, not to start fires. They are trying. They have been trying for a long time, and I believe they will keep trying. But they remember how. It is in there. In the hands of every quiet historian making tea in a station kitchen. In the posture of every person who stands at ease, not relaxed, not tense, but ready, always and quietly ready, in every room they occupy. In the sound that a sword makes when someone who knows how to hold one draws it slowly, in a room that has gone silent, with 300 people holding their breath and one Keth-Saron soldier standing at the door, suddenly unsure of the calculations he thought he had already made. That sound. Long, smooth, deliberate. The sound of something that was never not there, finally choosing to be heard. I am Thorindel Vo Essex, Senior Cultural Attaché, Confederacy Station Orleans, now entering my 15th year of posting. I am still married to Callan Morrow. He is currently teaching his third-year class on pre-contact military history at the Multi-Species Historical Institute. He made Dahl last week. He is reading his grandfather's book. He slept facing the door last night. He always does.